I'm here today to talk to you all about storytelling in higher education, for teaching and learning, assessment, and I'm going to touch on research. I should start by introducing myself. So my name is Charlotte Feather. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an early career academic, so I'm now going into my third year of teaching here at the university. I'm currently the Deputy Programme Leader for our Masters in Education and our Masters in International Education. And outside of that, I'm the chair of our Pride Network, or co-chair with my deputy chair, Donna, as well. So my background, I guess, is quite interesting when you look at that. My ancestry is Irish, English, and Native American, which is quite the mix when we're talking about colonialism. So I guess I'm descendant from the colonisers and the colonised, which is an interesting thing to kind of unpick. So I was thinking about my name. I've always really liked the name Feather as a surname. I often get comments on it, particularly being someone who works in education, saying that's a lovely teacher name, Miss Feather. I guess it's like Miss Honey or something. If I was a primary school teacher, but I'm not, I'm here in HE, so it's just Charlotte. So I do love my name, but there's a bit more behind my name as well. So kind of the etymology of it. In Native American tribes, Native American communities, eagle feathers hold quite a lot of significance culturally, and it's thought that actually those names have come from the significance of eagle feathers. So they were reflected in personal, so first names, and then that's kind of now shifted and have been adopted as surnames. So originally it would have probably been something like red feather or white feather, put in obviously a Native American language, and then that's been translated into English. I don't know a lot about my Native American heritage, and I think for me that's a little bit different. It's not because of being care experienced in any way, but I think more so it's tied to shame and this kind of lack of wanting to acknowledge that that is where my family were from. So growing up, I didn't know any of that. I knew that I had English and Irish heritage, but I didn't know anything to do with the American side. I could see visibly that my dad and my dad's side of the family were much darker skin toned, but they were just my family and I didn't really think about it until I'd had a conversation with my mum actually later on in my teens, where she kind of brought that to my attention, and it piqued my curiosity because I didn't know anything about it. So anyway, kind of going back to this name, we think that the name is most likely tied to the Lakota people, which is an area in a tribe within America, what is now North America, would be around kind of South Dakota area. But we don't know that for definite. It's just most likely that that's where my family is from. But because of that shame, I guess, and the lack of understanding and the lack of kind of generational knowledge being passed down, I don't have any stories to share from my grandparents, great-grandparents. I don't have any stories. And the reason that I'm kind of bringing that up and talking about that is because that's the focus of this session today, storytelling. So when we think of storytelling, I guess if I was to ask you to think about storytelling, there might be a certain image that comes to mind. Perhaps it's an adult reading to a child or you reading books. That's what we typically think of when we think of storytelling, kind of the written word. But actually storytelling is much more than the written word. We tell stories to each other all the time. Every time we engage in conversation, you ask about how someone's weekend was, they often tell you that in the form of a story, a narrative. When we go to the cinema and watch films, they're stories that we're engaging with. Adverts on TV, they tend to be formed around stories to make us feel something. Watching things like dance performances or theatre shows, all different forms of stories, telling campfire stories, and even on social media. We literally have Instagram stories, Snapchat stories, whatever it is that you use, Facebook, I guess, stories as well. So we're kind of obsessed with stories. I feel like stories are all around us, really ingrained in what we do as humans and how we exist. So I wanted to play a little video about the power of stories.
Long time ago, tribes from all over the world came together for a gathering. They had a good time. A challenge, actually, to see who could come up with the scariest thing. Some of them brewed potions. Some of them jumped in and out of animal skins. Some of them thought up devices, weapons, and traps, until finally there was only one tribe left who hadn't done anything. No one knew where this tribe came from, and all this tribe had was a story. The story this tribe had was a scary tale, full of fear, blood, horror. When the telling was done, the others trembled with fear. You win, they said. But what you just voiced, it's chilling. Take it back, they demanded. Call that story back. But of course, it was too late. For once a story is told, it cannot be called back. Once told, it stays with us forever. Stories have been with us forever. Do you remember your first stories? Bedtime, verbal, written, public, private, secret. Telling stories is like singing, like sports, like dancing, like music. When we hear good stories, two changes occur in our brains, neurological and chemical. When we hear straight facts, two areas of our brains light up. But when we listen to stories, neural activity increases 5-fold. At the chemical level, when we hear stories, our brains release oxytocin, the bonding hormone that causes us to really care about the people involved. This neurological and chemical stimulation is why sometimes we treat our favorite fictional characters as real people. Why sharing personal stories is the fastest way to bond with strangers, and why storytelling can be a tool to encourage behavioral change. Every event, every experience, every picture tells a story. Stories are not only a way to communicate and understand reality, they can also inspire collective and even transformative action. People can connect with each other through stories and place adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction into their own context. When responding to disasters and adapting to climate change, stories help us to make sense of our experiences. They help us to bring together the diversity of voices, knowledge, and perceptions. Extreme weather events like the heat waves that have hit Europe in July 2019 perfectly exemplify how much our perception of the same issue can differ. Stories can make it easier to notice the necessity to prepare for climate-related extreme events, prevent losses, and help us to continue to live a good life and value what is really important to us. In short, stories can be used as a tool to support rapid implementation of easy solutions, technical, urban, smart, resilience solutions. Stories affect our perception of the world, our decisions, and our actions. Stories can touch us, move us, and inspire us to act. Have you ever thought about using stories in your work?
I don't know if anyone else got the vibe at the end of that I was going to say Apple. The voice was really given an Apple advert. But I feel like that video just does a really good job of encapsulating this idea of story and how it's all around us. As I said, it's really embedded into who we are as humans. And in that video, talks about kind of how we're hardwired as humans to respond to stories. So we know that our brains release oxytocin, which enhance our empathy and our emotional connections, which is why it's a great way to connect with other people, who are maybe different from us, and also to help us understand ourselves. They also can help us to explore problems, navigate different dilemmas and solutions to problems. One of the things that's really interesting with stories is that they often reflect societal norms, but that gives us a great opportunity for communities or individuals to question those norms. Why are all of the fairy tales ending in this specific way? Why do we, most of the time, at least in the Western world, have stories that have a very clear beginning, have some kind of moral behind them? What is that moral? Who's that moral tied to? How have we come about to kind of think that that moral is a moral in itself? And so it allows us to kind of question those norms, I guess, and transform our thinking around them and our values. And that's a key element of decolonising in itself. And one of the things with stories is that they can really help us make these complex ideas easier to understand and to remember. So if you think back to being in school, you probably can't remember the specific maths lessons that you were taught, but it might be that actually you had that one teacher in that one lesson who was trying to teach you this abstract concept in maths, and they told a story around it, and all of a sudden it made sense because you connected to it, you related to it. So that's why stories are really important. We're naturally drawn to them, and we're actually hardwired to understand stories and to connect. And for Indigenous populations, stories are much more than that. Stories aren't just narratives, but ways of knowing and understanding the world. And they're deeply tied to cultural identity, memory, and community. So in terms of Indigenous storytelling, it's deeply rooted in native traditions, and they're used to pass down history, knowledge, and cultural values from one generation to the next generation. It helps connect, stories help connect people to their land and to their identity, and it reinforces this interconnectedness of all different forms of life, not just human life. Stories also help foster a holistic understanding, so they often incorporate emotional, spiritual, intellectual, and physical dimensions of knowledge, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later as well in terms of the types of knowledge and how we, I guess, recognise knowledge. Today, storytelling in Indigenous communities is really, really important. It's still really important, if not more so important today, for sustaining these communities that have been colonised, validating experiences, nurturing our relationships, and serving as a form of cultural continuation of Indigenous people. So how does this link to education? Because that's the context that we're in right now. So it's often the role in Indigenous communities of the elders, or sometimes known as knowledge keepers or historians, to share those stories and to pass on their wisdom to younger generations. Stories can take different forms. It might be that they're mythical or sacred. Some stories are used as pedagogical tools, which we're going to explore as well, to teach about life, and others serve as sources of strength and spirituality. So there's lots of different types of stories, and sometimes it might be that they're a mixture of those as well. So it might be a pedagogical tool that's also tied into spirituality, and we often see that kind of mixture of secular and spirituality within these Native American or native stories, Indigenous stories. Storytelling itself can help learners make links between prior and new knowledge. Again, kind of going back to that idea of making the complex, abstract ideas more tangible, more understandable, so that we can kind of move between what we don't know, or what we do know already, this existing knowledge, into new knowledge and understanding. And storytelling can create spaces for deep listening, which is an idea that kind of comes from Indigenous populations as well, this ability to sit and think deeply and understand deeply and listen to the story. Tie into decolonisation. So decolonising seeks to challenge and dismantle the dominance of Western modes of knowledge that have marginalised and erased Indigenous and non-Western ways of thinking. And storytelling plays a crucial role in this process by reclaiming narrative as a really powerful and valid form of knowledge, something that we don't often see in the West. Because colonisation has often privileged written forms of knowledge, and it'll actually dismiss oral traditions, and they're seen as kind of less so or other. Western pedagogies tend to separate knowledge into discrete categories or subjects. So even if you have a think about what we teach here at the university, you are on a teacher training course, or you are on a nursing course, or we split off into subjects in that way, and that's very different in Indigenous communities. They often integrate these different elements, these different subjects, into kind of this unified whole, and present knowledge as something that's really interconnected. And I think that's kind of more so how we exist as humans anyway. I don't anyway think of myself as someone who stood here today presenting a conference, and then when I leave this room, I'm a partner. And then when I go home tonight, no, that's everything. I'm everything all at once. I'm stood here as a woman, I'm stood here as a queer woman, I'm stood here as a queer autistic woman, I'm stood here with this Indigenous background and heritage. All of those things exist at once, but we tend to kind of separate these ideas of knowledge kind of into discrete subjects. In modern contexts, storytelling is a tool for reclaiming cultural identity and resisting colonisation's erasure of Indigenous voices. So what about in the HE context? So historically, higher education has been used as an enabler of colonisation, supplanting Indigenous-led educational practices with Western epistemologies and ontologies. Higher education has also been used to discredit the intellectual contributions of Indigenous populations, and in his seminal work said, if you haven't heard of this person before, I would really recommend having a look into it, had argued that university curricula have historically centred Western philosophical, scientific and literary traditions, which led to marginalising or erasing Indigenous knowledge systems. And in terms of research, researchers often treated Indigenous people as subjects to be studied rather than intellectual contributors themselves, and how they can exist with that research rather than being researched on. so being researched with. And that once again kind of reinforces this power imbalance between the West as the default and then the rest of the world, or the other. So storytelling in HE. So by integrating Indigenous storytelling, higher education educators, so some of us in this room, can foster holistic learning, promote cultural diversity and support decolonising efforts. And universities can use storytelling to try and integrate Indigenous knowledge across the various disciplines that we work within. One of the things that I think is great about storytelling in HE is that we can help reshape these classroom dynamics. I guess our Western tradition of this hierarchical expert who stands at the front, to a more collaborative learning approach. And I try to do that in my own practice. I will say to my learners from the get-go that I'm here to facilitate a conversation. So because I teach, it might be different because I teach at master's level, although I think this would work kind of across all different levels of the university. But I teach various different modules. I teach our critical thinking module, research methods, a range of our optional modules. And with all of those, I say I'm here to facilitate a conversation. I'm not an expert. I've been in HE for 3 years. I'm 26, and I'm teaching people who have been head teachers in schools for 20 years or have worked internationally in all of these different contexts and have so much experience and so much knowledge and understanding that I don't have. I'm not there to teach them how to be a teacher. That's not the point of our program. It's to take a step back, look at education in its broadest sense, and I'm there facilitating that conversation and learning. Of course, I am teaching them things, but I don't see myself as some kind of expert who stands at the front with all this knowledge. So we're trying to kind of move against that, I guess. So storytelling is one of the ways I think that we can kind of move away from that and engage in this shared knowledge creation. As I just said, I teach our critical thinking module, which I absolutely love. It's my favorite thing ever. And I think storytelling is a great way to promote critical thinking, especially around social norms, colonial legacies, and the implications of different ways of knowing. It helps foster our critical consciousness. It helps students to challenge and rethink these dominant narratives that we've kind of always been taught and exist within. And it also invites students to critically reflect on how knowledge itself is produced, whose voices are amplified, whose voices are silenced, and that actually helps the EDI more broadly as well, and that's something that I'm really interested in. Storytelling in HE also exposes students to Indigenous worldviews and promoting cultural competency, which is particularly relevant. And I've listed a few areas here, but I think it's broader than this. And I think it's really interesting because when we talk about that, or we talk about cultural capital, I think there's kind of a Western view that we have about that. So when we talk about children having cultural capital, some of the first things that we think about are, have they been to the theatre? Have they been to the capital city? All of these things that are very tied to Western norms and traditions. But actually, what about our learners who come from very diverse international contexts? What are they bringing with them? How are they going to add to our learning that we're experiencing in higher education? And I think storytelling also is great because it helps humanize the educator. I'm stood here as someone who is an early career academic. I'm 26, I'm queer, I'm a woman, I'm autistic, all of these different parts of me. I share that with my students as well, because I think that's really important. I think it's important that they see me as a human, because I am. And I think we don't do that enough in education, particularly in primary and secondary. We see that person at the front as the teacher, and we're not allowed to know anything about them. You're not allowed to know their first name. How dare we know the first name about the teachers? So I think that helps humanize us, and I think we can do that through storytelling. So talking about our experiences and sharing our lived experiences, which is something that the networks do really well as well. So how can we use storytelling as a pedagogical tool? I think that storytelling can be really powerful. And in practice, for me, this looks like recognizing that we exist in a community of experts. And that's ourselves, our colleagues, our students, and wider community as well. We can't always access the people, the guest lecturers that we want to come in from different institutions, or even people within our own institution, trying to get them to come and do guest lectures for us because we really want to hear their thoughts. That's really difficult when everyone is so overworked and doesn't have space within their workload. Sorry, I just can't do it. Okay, how can we utilize the people that we already have in class? I'll be stood in front of 50 people who are doing their master's degree, who have so much experience. Okay, how can I draw on them? How can I utilize the people in front of me to come and share their stories? to tell us, to teach us things about from their experiences. We don't always have to look outside, have a look within as well and see how we can use them. Invite them in. We don't want to force anyone to come and tell their story, but invite them to do that. We can also use stories to introduce complex theories or abstract concepts, like I said earlier. We can share stories of individuals or communities or movements to illustrate the impacts of historical events. We can present students with conflicting narratives or case studies and ask them to debate them or discuss them, whether that's ethically, socially, or the political implications of them. All of this, obviously, I love to do within our critical thinking module because it's naturally tied to that, but I think we can do that in probably, I would say, all of the modules, if not the majority of modules that we teach. We can present real-world problems in the form of stories and ask students to collaboratively develop solutions to them. And we can use multimedia tools such as podcasts or video stories or interactive simulations as well in our teaching.
Hi, my name's Annette Simpson. I'm the National Manager for Australian Indigenous College. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on where we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Learning and education wasn't always a good experience for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It was a very negative experience, so we want to change that and make learning a lot more fun and creative. At the Australian Indigenous College, we use the 8-way learning methodology. So one of the first things is story sharing. So every student is valued and comes into class with their stories and experiences, and we work on using those to assist them with their own learning. So we're valuing everyone's experiences. Another one of them is the learning maps. That helps them map out where they need to be, what they would like to achieve and how they will achieve it, and who can help them achieve those goals. Another one is the non-verbal. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people use a lot of non-verbal communication techniques. So we look at all those and look at also the symbols that we use, and we incorporate all that into our 8-way learning and the delivery. Another one that we use is land links. So looking at what's around on the land, the country that we're delivering the training on, acknowledging all the land links that are available, that are there, who belongs to the land, and how that will impact on their learning. And from there we can look at community links. So community links is looking at all the different organisations that can support their learning, even the elders in the community, how they can work in with the colleges that we have. At the Australian Indigenous College, we have elders come and visit us all the time and support not just the students but the staff. There were two more aspects to it, and that is the non-linear learning. So all those things are about the non-linear learning. So learning isn't just progressing one after the other. We learn on a variety of ways, and we look at all of those, we take them into account and think there's different ways to learn. One of the main things when the trainers are delivering the 8-way learning is to deconstruct and reconstruct. So they deconstruct what the students are learning, they're pulling it apart, all the units, what it's about, what assessments they need, how they can get the assistance, other networks and links that they might be able to get information from. Really pull it apart and then put it back together and explain what it's all about. So saying, all right, we need to do this for that reason. So make everything relevant. So they're really working on what the students are about. And one of the main things doing that is having a student-focused, passion-based learning. So focusing on the students and their values and what's relevant to them, and focusing on what they're passionate about. We embrace other cultures as well, but while they're coming into the Australian Indigenous College, they're learning about the 8-way learning, that they're learning about an Aboriginal learning method, and they're learning about Indigenous cultural ways as well.
The 8-way learning, to me, it is to be able to combine all of these things, you know. So we've got the things to land, our connection to land, which is very significant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The things about our networks, the networks of both our families, our extended families. Sometimes the non-verbal stuff is just as powerful, and we're there to support them. And you know, and that's the power that comes from this whole model of 8-way learning.
So going back a little bit, just to unpick this idea of knowledge, I like this quote there can be no global social justice without global cognitive justice. And what's meant by this is that cognitive justice involves the full and equal recognition of all the world's knowledge systems, languages, and cultural practices, not just Western or Eurocentric knowledge and knowledge systems. For Indigenous communities, knowledge creation is intergenerational, iterative, and intercultural. So what that means is that knowledge is passed down from generation to generation. It's seen as this continuous and evolving process where knowledge is refined and then deepened as it's revisited. So it's not kind of seen in this linear form that maybe we're used to in the West. And it's intercultural, so knowledge is created and shared across different cultures and across different communities. What that looks like then in terms of assessment is that assessment is more holistic, or would be benefited by being more holistic, focusing on the collective and the relational and community-based outcomes. So how can storytelling be used for assessment? For me, the purpose of an assessment is to see how our students, how our learners can demonstrate their understanding and their skills. That's kind of fundamentals of what an assessment is, what the purpose of it is for. Hopefully for them to be able to take that feedback and improve their knowledge and their skills. So instead of relying solely on exams or written assignments, which is what I think we default to, that type of assessment prioritizes this linear thinking. And I think storytelling can be used as an alternative form of assessment. So I've listed just a few examples here of storytelling within assessment. So things like narrative assignments, where students incorporate storytelling into presentations. It might be through written submissions, oral histories, or creative work. So for example, creating a story to explain a scientific process or an ethical dilemma that they're facing. It could be through personal reflection. So this is something that we do actually within our critical thinking module. We get our students, they do 4 small assignments within the module. So it's a 30 credit module. They do 4 assignments, 2 that are 1,000 words and 2 that are 1,500. It's really interesting when we tell students that it's the first module that they study, and you get, I would say, probably 50% of the room who are like, yes, amazing, short assignments, love it. And then the other 50% that absolutely freak out and go, how on earth am I only going to write 1,000 words? I've got so much to say. But it's interesting. I think actually by the end of that process, they can see how that's beneficial. But one of the reasons that we do that is to help them write in a concise way so that they can then support as they move to research methods and the thesis module. So our first assignment gets them to reflect. We do it really early on, which they hate us for because it's in like week 3. We're like, right, you've got your first assignment. But we get them just to reflect on their experiences, critically reflect on their experiences and their understanding of critical thinking, which obviously at this point, 3 weeks in, they're like, no idea, still don't know what you're talking about. And then at the end, our final point of assessment for that module is for them to reflect again on that learning journey. And one of the things that we do is we get them to keep a learning journal. Some of them do it, some of them don't. That's the nature of teaching. But the ones who do keep that learning journal and reflect on their experiences as they go through the module, you really see that demonstrated then or reflected in their final assignment where they come to do this overall reflection. So that's one of the ways that we use that, I guess. It kind of demonstrates that professional growth through storytelling. There's also other methods that could be used, so digital storytelling. This is something I guess we're kind of leaning into within research methods. Again, they were 2 written assessments, so we've got one that's a critical analysis of papers, and then another assessment within that module that's their thesis proposal. We've changed this year from the thesis proposal being a 2,500 word written assignment to a presentation, because if you want to talk about your thesis, naturally, I feel like that should be an oral thing, right? So we're going to get them to create a presentation and they're going to present it to us. Things like that, digital storytelling, it might be story-based case studies. I've put on their learning journals as well, which can be used for formative assessment as they go through the process. Collaborative assessments, where students are working together, and then creative writing, if that's something within your field that you could use. So there are lots of different ways that we can use storytelling in assessment, and I think it's just about shifting our mindset from maybe these more traditional methods that we're used to. And I think actually now as a university, we're being forced to, because of AI, to be a bit more creative with our assessments. So I'm only going to briefly touch on this, but research is often seen as a continuation of colonialism, where Indigenous lands, bodies and knowledge have been mined for data without consideration of the impact on those Indigenous communities. So historically, researchers have entered Indigenous lands and extracted knowledge to benefit themselves, to benefit Western educational institutions without any benefit or recognition of the communities that they've entered. And often that involves discrediting Indigenous knowledge, viewing Western knowledge as something that's universal and Indigenous knowledge as just something that's local and just exists in that one space. It's not as valuable as our Western universal knowledge that we all have, which was also a form of marginalisation used to delegitimise Indigenous intellectual contributions. And also cultural exploration and objectification of Indigenous people, so being studied on rather than studying with. So how can storytelling be used for research? So Indigenous storytelling, I think, for me, should be seen as a valid research methodology. I think it is a valid research methodology. Stories can be data and can hold crucial insights about history, identity, and knowledge systems, and they can be used to challenge these positivist methodologies that seek to objectify knowledge and instead centre Indigenous ways of knowing. So one of the ways that we can use storytelling in research is through narrative inquiry. And I actually unknowingly engaged, not unknowingly, I did the research, but I did narrative inquiry for my master's research a few years ago before I kind of even looked into any of this. And narrative inquiry is all around collecting stories and analysing stories about specific communities. So my master's research was on the identity formation and navigation of queer early career teachers, absolute mouthful. But it was about getting that participant voice. So it was about these queer early career teachers telling me their stories, their experience of how they navigate their personal, professional identity in educational contexts. So that's one way that we can use storytelling. It emphasises ethical and respectful engagement with participants, and it ensures that cultural and community-based knowledge is presented in context and not appropriated. And then there's also something called decolonial ethnography. So anyone who knows anything about ethnography, traditionally kind of the Western ethnography involves researchers from colonial powers studying and documenting Indigenous people or communities, obviously beyond that as well, but for the sake of this, often from an outsider's perspective. So going in and looking at it, looking at a community and seeing what they're doing. And these studies were often extractive, with researchers benefiting professionally and the institutions benefiting, but actually the community not benefiting themselves. So decolonial ethnography looks at kind of undoing this and centering Indigenous voices and co-creating knowledge with the people in the communities to ensure that that research is beneficial for them. So I found this and I thought it was a really nice graphic just to kind of summarise everything that I'm saying there around research. I love a Venn diagram. I feel like I put a Venn diagram on every presentation that I present. So we can see there on the left this Western research knowledge and methodologies, and on the right, Indigenous knowledge and methodologies. And what I like is that both of those circles are equal in size. So it's not that we're saying Indigenous knowledge is more powerful, and it's not that we're saying Western is less so or is more important. They're both equal forms of knowledge, equal ways of knowing and understanding and carrying out research. And actually, it's about bringing those together and kind of looking at that intersection and ensuring mutual respect, shared benefits, human dignity, and discovery. So all of that, I've kind of talked about a few different things within that. I've talked about storytelling as a pedagogical tool. I've talked about storytelling in HE specifically, storytelling for assessment, storytelling for research, all storytelling. But there's challenges to it. Of course, there are challenges. We need to recognise that Western institutions, our institution itself, might resist these narrative-based methods, and other academics and other institutions might see them as non-academic. So if you're trying to get your work published, for example, it might be actually that it doesn't fit with what they're after because they're not seeing that as a valid research methodology. But actually what I'm seeing is that more and more publishers are open to kind of these, I don't like this term innovative because actually they've always been there, but these more innovative or creative methodologies. We also need to make sure that we avoid appropriating Indigenous storytelling traditions without proper engagement and respect. But read into it first, try and understand. I know that we're all here today learning and you've come along for this exact reason, so you're doing it, you're doing it for the right reasons, but it's really important that we have that understanding. That's not to say that you need to be an expert in any of this to give it a go, because you absolutely don't. I'm not an expert. This is all still very new for me as well. But I think having that recognition of kind of the people who've come before you and why this is really important needs to be the first thing that we do. And we also need to recognise the ethical obligations of working with Indigenous stories and knowledge. So if we are actually specifically sharing some of those stories, we need to recognise that. We need to recognise why those stories exist, where they came from, who might have shared them, but you should still share them. I'm not kind of saying that to warn you off. I want us all to engage with this, but just, I guess, with that level of mindfulness as well. So I wanted to end with this quote. This is Kent Monkman, who's a Cree artist. Have a look at his work because it's great. And he says, history is a narrative. It's a collection of stories sanctioned by the ruling power and reinforced through words and images that suit them. And I think that's really, really powerful.